So I'm officially at the time of year where I start panic reading books, trying to finish up all of my end of the year content, and so I have a whole bunch of new releases, some that I love, some that I didn't, science fiction, fantasy here, as well as some backlist titles that I'm trying to sneak in before I finish everything up, before I check it off and call it a year. And so if that all sounds good, if you're interested in sticking around, let's get started. First, let's talk science fiction, starting with one of the best new releases I've read all year in the genre. I talked about how this year has been a little bit of a slump, a little bit of a letdown, and thankfully I'm getting a comeback. A lot of you recommended this one, and that is Alien Clay by Adrian Tchaikovsky. I believe this book came out earlier in the UK, and so I think a lot of you had already read it. It's just coming out now. This is from Orbit, US, and I finally got my hands on it, and I can say that it is fantastic. So this is one where we follow humanity, where they have discovered alien artifacts of an ancient race on this alien planet, and so this is a huge breakthrough discovery for humanity. We particularly follow the story from the perspective of this professor who is very interested in devoting his life to this research and learning more about it. However, through circumstances, he ends up almost exiled to this planet in a labor camp, and the story goes from there. This is one I love for so many reasons. First, I thought that it was just a good piece of storytelling. I know with some of Adrian Tchaikovsky's work, I'm thinking more the Children of Time series, where I think that that one is a bit more about the ideas and perhaps a little bit less about the individual characters, can be a bit off-putting to readers that are not used to that aspect of science fiction. In this one, I think you have a distinct protagonist who you follow, you understand. It feels much more personable than some of his other work, and I really love that because I often say that I love his ideas but didn't think that his strength was characters. I might need to revise that mention because in my mind, this was a fully fleshed out individual. I really cared for this person, this man, and I wanted to see what was going to happen to him. I worried and cared and wanted to follow him through these adventures. And an adventure it definitely was. I am a sucker for the trope of alien technology and alien ruins, and so the setup of this one was right up my alley. And again, it had a great character at the center of the story and also a great narrative drive. It moved forward, it progressed, it had a clear direction the story was going, good twists and turns, and I was just very much invested in the larger picture. For me, maybe this is sacrilegious to say, but this is what I wanted and expected from Mercy of the Gods by James S.A. Corey, which again was not a bad book per se, but really was a letdown based off my experience and excitement after really loving The Expanse. I would say that if you love The Expanse, this is the book I'd recommend following up with that, because it had very similar tropes and again, kind of similar plot points in a way, similar ideas, very much its own, but really enjoyable. It's also very smart, so you have these elements of science that are woven into the story. I really got to see Adrian Tchaikovsky geek out and really share all of his knowledge with me as a reader. It reminded me a touch of Neil Stephenson, who I think is one of the best at doing info dumps in a way that never feels info dumpy and instead just feels really enjoyable to spend time with him and his characters. And I just had a great time reading this one. So if you're like me and kind of were left a little bit disappointed or lacking from Mercy of the Gods, pick up this one next. It was so good, so gripping, smart. It's a standalone, so if you're tired of slogging through long series, if you need a break, something to fly through. It's not exactly short, but it's a single book and it's so gripping. I personally could not put it down. I just ripped through it, and I think a lot of you will love it too. Highly recommend. This is possibly my favorite full-length novel from Adrian Tchaikovsky. Don't hold me to that, but it's definitely a tie with Shards of Earth. Next up is Unexploded Remnants by Elaine Gallagher. This is a short sci-fi novella that follows a young woman who is assumingly the last human alive, and she ends up coming across this AI technology. She tries to help it, however, she finds out that this AI potentially is this very catastrophic weapon, and then she has to deal with it from there. This is a book that has a really ambitious plot packed into a really small novel, and I do admit that it sounded amazing, and the actual story that I got for me didn't quite live up to the giant stakes that it proclaims, and so I can't personally recommend this one. I was quite disappointed by it. For me, this one just didn't have enough time to develop the ideas it wanted to. It felt very rushed, the narrative felt uneven, and it just again felt like too big of a plot lot in too small of a book, which I've seen other authors do successfully, but was not the case here. I was really let down by this one just because, again, the premise sounded amazing, but the actual execution, for me at least, was not. Next up, we have Shadow Speaker by Nnedi Okorafor. This is the first book in what I believe is a duology, and this is one that is set in a near future of Africa. It's a piece of speculative fiction where we follow someone, this woman who as a young girl had her father assassinated. However, you find out that he was actually this very terrible politician, but of course in her eyes, he was simply her father and sees it through that colored perspective. And so now as an adult, she is seeking revenge and we follow her through this journey. And this is one where I wanted to love it a lot more than I did. I will admit I'm very hit or miss when it comes to Nnedi Okorafor. Again, she's an author who I always want to love. I've loved a lot of other African speculative authors, but this is one that I think was a little bit messy in terms of narrative, in my opinion, and also suffered from the fact that it was a mashup of science fiction fantasy, hence why I'm using the word speculative. And for me, while certainly if you follow some of my favorites, I absolutely can love sci fantasy when it's blended together, but I like it done in certain ways, and I found that this one was a little bit murky because while it has these science-ish elements set in this future, once you bring in the magic, it really lost me in some of the world building where things became a lot more murky and lacked the precision that I often like in my science fiction, where you really can't tell the line between what is magic and what isn't, which again might appeal a lot more to other readers, but it's something that either works really well for me or doesn't, and in this case, unfortunately, it did not. So I didn't entirely love this one. I wasn't completely immersed and interested in the characters. Certainly the characters are meant to be morally gray and difficult, and I appreciate that, but while I have loved some very unlikable characters, I just didn't find myself that interested in these. Again, I can really like someone who's doing terrible things, but these characters to me were a little bit flat and I just didn't really care about them regardless of what they were doing. So kind of a miss for me. I'm still interested in picking up the second volume just to see where it goes because I want to love this author so much, but from this first half, I'm kind of underwhelmed. Next up, we have Alliance Rising by CJ Cherryh and Jane Fancher, and this is a story that is set in a future where there is this remote space station where there is this unidentified ship that is coming towards it, and there's a lot of mystery surrounding it. That is the basic premise of the story. This one I was very excited about because CJ Cherryh has become an author who I really love to watch. I've been interested in reading more of their books, and I was completely unaware of this series, this crossover with this other author who personally I'm not familiar with. But this was a lot of fun. It was an adventure story, it was action-packed, it had suspense again around the ship, and I think it had a lot of the pieces I liked. In terms of a first book, I liked it. It's not an instant favorite. I don't think it'll make my end of the year favorites, but I definitely think that if you're looking for somewhat newer releases that are doing some good things or just doing a lot of things right, even if they are very familiar tropes, but doing them well, I think that there's definitely an audience for this one. I believe there's a new book that is coming out, so I'm hoping to get my hands on it because I'd love to see where it goes. I'm unsure if this is going to be a duology or a trilogy or something longer, but absolutely I think there's a lot of really good parts moving in this story and I'd like to see more. Again, it just very much felt like a startup story, a little bit safe, a little bit predictable, but still a solid science fiction read, which sometimes when it comes to a lot of modern books that have been letting me down lately, sometimes all I want is a good book. I don't always need it to be great or life-changing, I just need it to be good. Let me know if anyone else feels the same way. Now let's switch over to fantasy, starting with A Tide of Black Steel by Anthony Ryan. This is his newest book, a new start to an epic fantasy series, so if you're interested in checking out this author, this is a potential starting point without having read any of his backlist books. In this one, it follows siblings that go off on separate adventures that end up really competing against each other, trying to succeed at each other's expense. It's a general trope I really enjoy when you have either best friends or siblings or those with some kind of relationship bond that end up on different sides of a divide. And so in terms of our premise, I was really intrigued by it, but this is one of these books that I always say I appreciate but didn't exactly love. And so to try to hone in on that a little bit more, it's the fact that I think objectively the writing I felt was solid. There was never a time where I thought that the prose were weak or getting in the way or stumbling through the story. In terms of the characters, the author certainly spent a lot of time developing them, never in a way that I personally found very engrossing. I was never really attached to the characters. And again, while the author technically set up that bond between the siblings, I didn't emotionally feel it. And so this is always where it's hard to tell if the author did not succeed in creating that emotional depth, or simply if it was something with my reading experience where it just didn't work for me. And I mention that because of the fact that I know his previous series, that starts with The Traitor, is beloved, and I only found that series to be just okay. I enjoyed Bloodsong a lot more. That coming of age narrative is just a trope and a plot that I really enjoy. So I enjoyed that first book. I know the sequels are not supposed to be great, but anyway, this is one that I'm very much aware might appeal to those of you that love The Traitor more than I enjoyed that one. And so I liked what this book was doing. Objectively, I had no real criticisms of it other than the fact that I liked it, but wasn't overly engrossed in the story, immersed in it. I didn't feel a deep connection to the characters, and because of that, it definitely dampened my reading experience. So keep that in mind. If you love this author, you definitely want to check this one out, because I think it's very much on par with what The Traitor was doing. And if you want to check out this author, I think it's representative of their work. It's just not my personal favorite. Next up, we have Between Dragons and Their Wrath by David Madson. And this is one where we follow 3 different perspectives in this rebellion. So there is an alchemist, there is someone who is skilled with poisons, and then there is a sharpshooting dragon rider, and we follow them through this upheaval in this epic fantasy world. And this is the start of a new fantasy series, so again, you can start here without having read the author's backlist titles. I have read their previous series, and I will say that this one is very much representative of what you would expect. So if you've read her other books, I think that this is on par in terms of the same writing style, which I found to be very simplistic. I found the characters to be fairly straightforward, but also easy to like. I would describe this as easy fantasy, where it's not the kind that requires a lot of challenge. It's not very difficult or verbose in terms of the prose. The characters are what you would expect, again, very likable, but perhaps not as complex as I personally like, because again, I really like those characters that get very morally gray, and these one felt a bit more straightforward to me. So very much checking the boxes of an easy, digestible, epic fantasy read, and I think the start of a fun series, but again, not one that will personally become a favorite of mine just because I'm looking for something with a little bit more depth, a little bit more complexity that I didn't find here. But again, if you love their other series, I think that you'll find more that you love here, because I think it's very consistent with what she's done before in her other series. So recommend it to the right audience if you're just looking for more fantasy, something a little newer or underhyped, and it sounds like a fun premise, check it out, but just go in knowing that it might not blow your mind, change your life, and anything along those lines, but still be perhaps a fun, enjoyable, escapist read. Next up, I have 2 books in the same series, the first one being Gods of the Wyrdwood, which is really hard to say, by R.J. Barker, and then its sequel, Warlords of Wyrdwood. There we go. And both these books again are in the same series. I'm only going to talk about the plot points of book 1 so that I don't spoil anyone who hasn't started it yet. In the beginning of the first book, we follow 2 different characters. So there is a man who has become a skilled person in navigating this forest. He previously was a warrior. And then the beginning of the story, he is tied in with this woman who has to venture into the woods. And so she asks for his help, and together they travel there. This is an author who has slowly creeped up in my reading life. I have some subscribers who are huge fans of his backlist books and have given me chances to read some of the other books that he has written, and so I was very excited to read some of his newer releases. The series that is still ongoing, there will be a 3rd book coming out soon, and the things I really love about him. So first off, I think he does a great job of creating a really unique narrative voice. So while I would argue in a way the setup for this series is not overly unique, or at least it pulls from different things that could be considered tropey in different ways, but yet the way he tells the story, I think there's something immediately likable about the characters. Not that they are just straight up likable people, but the story is told in a way where it just, again, feels like the author has a clear voice. It doesn't feel generic, and that is what I often suffer with when I'm reading a lot of, especially fantasies. I feel I read so much of it that it starts to all read the same, and this author, to me, always feels a little bit different. And again, while the premise of this one, the general setup, is not something crazy out of the box unique, something I've never read before, there's something about the way the story is presented that makes a premise that otherwise would be very ho-hum, very traditional, feel newer or fresher than it really should be. And so I really love that about this book and this series. I'd say the first book very much is representative of what you'll get in the second book. I enjoyed both of them very equally, and my thoughts about the 2 books are very much tied together because I read them back to back. So if you've read the first book and liked it, there's no reason not to continue on with the series. It's not an all-time favorite, and I think it's the fact that while I very much, again, appreciate the narrative voice of the story, I found the story itself, again, to be a bit predictable. So for this one, I liked it, but I do do admit it wasn't a new favorite of mine once again, and that is simply because of the fact that I didn't have an incredibly immersive, engrossive experience with it. It's not the kind of book or series that really left me thinking about it when I wasn't reading it, or kind of ticking those other boxes that really make something a particular favorite of mine. It's doing a lot of things right. I absolutely recommend it to the right audience. I think, again, those of you that read a lot of fantasy and are looking for something that is really polished, great prose, great character work, it checks those boxes. For me, it just didn't quite hit me in the heart or the emotional feels, or that's something that really attached me to the story in a deeper way, and those are often the books that become favorites for one reason or another. So recommend it to the right audience. I can see it not being for everyone, but I also see why there are so many hardcore fans of this author, because I think he's doing a lot of things right and not getting enough love for everything he is putting out these days. And last, I want to talk about Malice by Gwynne, which is the first book, an epic fantasy quartet. This is a story told over multiple points of view and particularly centers around the idea of prophecy. There are those that are destined to fulfill certain roles, and so it follows a reasonably tropey or familiar fantasy plot, but I think it does it very well. So one thing with this story is, as I mentioned, it has multiple perspectives, but I found each of the characters to be quite unique in a way that I really could remember each one, in a way that other stories that have multiple protagonists really can start to blend together and everyone kind of sounds the same or has the same voice. Instead, these ones all have really unique backstories and were easy to remember and understand. It's a book I really enjoyed. It was immersive. It kind of scratched that itch I was looking for at the time for that epic fantasy story. There's a reason this author is so beloved, and I liked it. For whatever reason, I haven't continued on with the series despite really enjoying book one. I've started and stopped book two a couple times, and I'm not quite sure why. It still seemed to be at the same level, but for whatever reason, I think I waited too long and just lost a little bit of my momentum. But I need to continue and give you a proper full series review, but I need to read them first, and for whatever reason, I'm hitting a roadblock, so give me some encouragement here. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to know the books I talked about. Which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself? And please let me know what is one of the best books you're reading right now. What are some final books I should sneak in before the end of the year when I compile all of my favorites? I'll be doing my backlist favorites at the end of October and November, and then I'll be doing my favorite favorites for 2024 closer to Christmas in December. So if that all sounds good, hopefully you stick around and subscribe. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up, drop a comment, even if just emoji, hit that notification bell, and I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.